1942, summer, the young man who would become the most decorated soldier of the war did not enlist for grand ideals. He sought the simple, urgent prospect of adventure. He also needed a clean escape from crushing poverty. Audie Murphy was slight of build. His face barely hinted at shaving. His youthful appearance was nearly his undoing in the military. Superiors saw a boy where they expected a man. They repeatedly attempted to shield him from the front line. Yet Murphy actively resisted this protective hand. He was driven by an intense internal need to prove himself. He pushed relentlessly toward the front lines. His unit's introduction to combat followed a delayed landing in Sicily. It was immediate and profoundly disorienting. There was no gentle acclimatization to the fight. Instead, they were thrust into chaotic fighting. The rules of civilization dissolved instantly on the battlefield. The machine gun quickly revealed itself as the devil's own weapon. It was a tool of cold, efficient mass death. Its chatter shredded any romantic notions of glorious warfare Murphy might have carried. The brutal education of the battlefield culminated quickly. It happened on the Sicily beachhead in a single devastating moment. Griffin, a comrade, was standing near Murphy. A shell explosion tore violently through the air. The suddenness and finality of the death were absolute. This moment served as a brutal turning point for Murphy. It forced him to confront the terrifying immediacy of his new reality. It stripped away his initial innocence. The grind continued as Allied forces pushed toward the Italian mainland. Near Salerno, the unit faced a deadly obstacle. A concealed machine gun emplacement was spitting fire. It pinned down the entire advance. They made a desperate, visceral attempt to neutralize the threat. During this attempt, Steiner was killed. Steiner was a soldier, already struggling with the psychological weight of army life. Yet, amidst the terror, there were flashes of immense courage. This was most notably seen in Brandon. His stoicism masked a fiercely determined will to fight. The psychological toll of the campaign began to manifest across the company. They endured the harrowing crossing of the Furiano River. They were under a heavy concentration of artillery and mortar fire. This proved too much for Sergeant Olson. He suffered a complete psychological breakdown. He hysterically refused to continue fighting the war. This stark failure underscored the varied and profound responses to extreme stress. The men adapted to the new reality, but the adaptation was grim. Belzi offered only practical, cold advice on mere survival. Novak was fueled by a searing sense of injustice. He thought constantly of the suffering of his Polish homeland. Novak vowed to become harder and more ruthless. Physically, the men were degraded by relentless marches. They sometimes covered 25 to 30 miles a day. They marched over rugged, unforgiving terrain toward objectives like Palermo. Exhaustion became a constant companion. It bred a weary indifference that settled heavily over Murphy. Yet, these brutal encounters forged profound, unbreakable bonds of camaraderie. These soldiers faced overwhelming odds together. They had seen the true face of war. It was visceral, terrifying, and often mundane in its brutality. The Sicilian campaign extracted a heavy price. It had taken the vinegar out of his spirit. The young man who sought adventure had been initiated. He was transformed into a hardened survivor. He now understood the true, crushing cost of the conflict. The Italian campaign devolved rapidly. It shifted from a planned offensive into a muddy, attritional struggle. This reality was far removed from the swift victories envisioned by commanders. The men lived in a state of perpetual filth and exhaustion. Their existence was reduced to a primal search for warmth and calories. Soldiers like Novak demonstrated extreme resourcefulness simply to survive. Novak was a Polish immigrant. His fierce loyalty to America was matched only by his passionate hatred for the Germans. He blamed them for the destruction of his homeland. He meticulously maintained a tiny coffee stove. It was a fragile altar to normalcy in a world consumed by chaos. Carrigan was pragmatic and darkly cynical, that he used a constant stream of dark humor as his primary defense mechanism. Brandon, the quiet man from Kentucky, wrestled silently with thoughts of the life he had left behind. His inner turmoil was masked completely by stoicism. Their immediate world was defined entirely by scarcity. The need to scrounge for coffee, cigarettes, and decent rations was paramount. This stripped away any pretense of grand warfare. They took over an abandoned dugout, initially seeking refuge from the persistent rain. They found only a sour stench and a dense infestation of fleas. The greatest scarcity, however, was water. This lack of water became a deadly obsession for Antonio. His idealized vision of Italy had been shattered. It was not a place of family and reunion. It was a place of crawling with lice and being perpetually buried in mud. Antonio was driven by an overwhelming thirst and despair. He attempted a desperate dash to find a water source. The enemy fire was constant and brutally arbitrary. Antonio's desperate attempt became his undoing. His death was swift, brutal, and utterly meaningless in the grand scheme of the conflict. It was a pivotal, tragic moment. It underscored the randomness of life and the brutal consequences of even the most basic human need. Even hardened soldiers like Novak struggled to offer comfort in the face of such senseless loss. The tactical reality of the grind often demanded suicidal courage. During the advance towards Mignano, visibility was drastically cut. It was obscured by slippery mud and heavy autumn mist. A critical moment of danger arose near dawn. They had discovered a German patrol. The unit relied heavily on Swope, a calm and deadly marksman. Swope possessed nerves of iron. He lay in wait, his stillness mirroring the surrounding rocks. He waited until the enemy was within perfect range. The silence was then broken by precise, surgical firing. 20 rounds erupted from his Browning automatic. This eliminated the immediate threat. It reinforced the grim, practical truth that the only safe Germans are dead ones. Later, the unit found itself caught in a desperate trap. A camouflaged German tank suddenly revealed itself. It was a symbol of hidden danger, its muzzle lowered directly upon them. In that moment, survival hinged on a terrifying strategic decision. The soldiers had to act as pigeons. They had to draw the tank's attention and fire toward themselves. This allowed another unit a chance to attack from the rear. It was a terrifying, exposed deception. It highlighted how seemingly small, desperate actions were crucial to achieving larger objectives. The constant threat and the necessity of becoming a killer stripped away the foundations of sanity for many men. The psychological toll was not always marked by momentary hysterics. It was often a slower, deeper erosion of the spirit. Thompson was a replacement soldier. He had witnessed the death of comrades killed by burp guns and artillery concussion. Thompson rapidly acquired the cautious demeanor of an experienced soldier. Yet, his nerves eventually collapsed entirely. His desertion was not born of malice, it was born of overwhelming fear. Confronted later about his choice, Thompson articulated the raw cost of survival. He stated with chilling clarity, "What's 20 years compared to a corpse?" He explained the battlefield reality. You attack and you keep on attacking until you're dead. His words were born of shattered nerves. They starkly challenged the myth of the fearless soldier. The only defense against this terrible erosion was grim camaraderie. They knew the man next to them was fighting the same filthy, terrifying war. Only by clinging to that fragile bond could any of them hope to push forward. The spring of static warfare on the Anzio beachhead settled into a monotonous, soul-crushing routine. The earth was soaked by ceaseless rain. It became an endless bog. The constant slog through mud on routine duty eroded the men's mental fortitude faster than any shell fire. The psychological strain led to fractured nerves. It caused a pathological boredom so profound that soldiers began volunteering for dangerous patrols. They were desperate to spike the rot of existence. They shivered and hobbled constantly. Their feet were turning blue from trench foot. Rear echelon medics often dismissed this ailment. They offered nothing more than a couple of aspirins and a pack of foot powder. The distant, absurd concerns of the civilian world only amplified the soldiers' profound sense of alienation. They heard news about Charlie Chaplin and Yellow Handkerchief murders. This environment necessitated brutal, often futile operations. On one such night, seeking intelligence, a prisoner of war raid was mounted. Carrigan frequently poured his dark cynicism into poetry. He muttered lines like, "The crosses grow on Anzio, where hell is 6 feet deep." He approached the German position with Cole. Cole's German skills were essential, but his grasp of local dialects was imperfect. The raid was quick and violent. It involved 4 grenades, a blinding flash, and the sound of screaming. In the chaotic escape, Murphy felt his fingers become sticky with blood from an injury. They returned with a single, trembling survivor. Once interrogated, the survivor offered no useful information. This underscored the grim, often meaningless nature of these desperate gambits. As May arrived, the long, bitter Anzio campaign was finally ending. The soldiers yearned for the massive, all-out attack. This attack was promised to break the line and end the war before winter. They knew, however, that the German defences were fortified. They understood resistance would be fanatical. The primary objective was Cisterna. The advance began with a deceptive quiet. As the first platoon crossed the railroad cut, the German guns remained silent. This successfully lured the second platoon forward. Murphy was the last to cross. He was instantly pinned down on the bank by bullets that cracked like millions of bullwhips. The stench of rock dust filled his nostrils. The young, eager replacement Flak had volunteered for every patrol. They collapsed across an iron railing, lost in the first minutes of the offensive. The cost of tactical gains was illustrated by sheer, desperate sacrifice. As the fighting intensified, Sergeant Lutzky, a heroic figure, recognized a necessity. He had to neutralize a German strongpoint that was bleeding the company dry. He made a suicidal charge. He advanced 60 yards on his final attempt. He inspired his men by his sheer bravery despite the overwhelming concentration of enemy fire. He made 3 full assaults before succumbing that bought freedom for his comrades with his life. The campaign extracted an immense personal toll. This was measured in the loss of long-standing comrades. Abraham Homer Johnson was better known as Horseface. He earned the nickname for his elaborate, improbable tall tales. He had always seemed indestructible, yet he was killed in a foxhole by a random piece of shrapnel. His last words were whispered amidst the chaos. He requested that any male from South Carolina be burned to protect his wife. His death was a significant emotional blow. It reinforced Murphy's grim understanding that the war was indiscriminate. It spared neither the cynical nor the seemingly invincible. When the soldiers finally reached Rome, the dream of a triumphant entry dissolved into profound indifference. There was no elation, only weariness. Their spirits felt soggy and waterlogged. They pitched tents in a public park. They resented the gaiety and pressed uniforms of the rear echelon troops who had never seen the front. Elleridge, an ex-schoolteacher and replacement, attempted to lecture them on Rome's glories. He was only met with blank stares. The only true relief came in alcohol. It offered a violent release for pent-up aggression. The chaos culminated in a massive bar fight involving the infantry and the Air Corps. Chairs flew as men slugged it out. Despite emerging with a black eye, Carradine found a strange contentment in the scrap. He remarked it was the most fun he had since a hog ate his little brother. For the infantry, even a drunken melee felt less brutal than the fighting in the field. Rome, Murphy realized, was merely another objective on an endless road called war. Amidst the constant psychological strain, Murphy yearned for a genuine human connection. He sought a brief escape from the brutal reality. He clung to an idealized vision of a young woman named Maria. He imagined her in a peaceful home, with poplars and a singing bird. This was a potent symbol of lost normalcy. Upon arriving in Naples for a brief pass, the grim reality of wartime encounters quickly superseded his fantasy. In a cafe, soldiers mixed with prostitutes, Carradine interacted cynically with a woman named Goldteeth.
Murphy eventually met the real Maria.
She was introduced by Drago. She wore a simple cotton dress and worn sandals, yet she possessed a captivating shyness mixed with a defiant toss of her chin. Her mother viewed him with frank anxiety. She deemed him too young for a soldier. Using gestures and a shared dictionary, they learned of each other's losses. Her father, a shoemaker, expressed silent grief for his own son, killed in action. He shared the universal sentiment, La guerra male, meaning war is bad. Their fragile connection was violently shattered by the wail of an air raid siren. As bombs fell, they turned the night sky into a terrifying spectacle of ack-ack fire. Maria displayed remarkable courage, refusing to seek shelter. She revealed that her brother had been killed by the English, yet she insisted on staying, her grip tightening on Murphy's hand as the house shook. The respite was brief. Soon after, Murphy was seized by a malarial attack. His fever soared to 105 degrees. Disoriented and physically weakened, he was taken to the infirmary tent by Novak. He was drifting in and out of consciousness. There, amidst the scent of strong tobacco smoke, he was attended by a gentle nurse nicknamed Violet Eyes. When he was finally released 15 days later, the sting of his physical ailment was profound. His unit had moved on. Thurb was left behind, temporarily separated from the only men who truly understood the cost of the conflict. He was a survivor. Yet the war, whether through a fever or a shell, was relentless in its pursuit of the body and the spirit. The transition to the Western Front brought no relief. It brought only a new level of widespread destruction and carnage. This eclipsed the attrition of Italy. If the Italian campaign had stripped away innocence, the fighting in France and the subsequent push into Germany began to erode the very notion of self. The landscape was a testament to overwhelming, senseless violence. On one road, hundreds of horses lay dead. They had been caught in a barrage. Their eyes were puzzled and unblaming. This sight profoundly disturbed Mahler, a gentle Texan. He looked at the self-inflicted carnage. He declared himself ashamed to belong to the human race. He expressed a desperate desire to live in isolation after the war. The necessity of killing to survive forced soldiers like Mahler to shed their civilian sensibilities. They had to adopt a ruthless pragmatism. This transformation was starkly illustrated when Mahler, unable to bear the suffering of a wounded horse, shot it himself. The relentless advance became a story of progressive, devastating loss. One by one, the familiar faces disappeared forever. Snuffy, the drunken boaster, was lucky enough to suffer a $1 million wound. This injury served as a ticket home that seemed like an almost divine intervention. Constantino fell, entrusting his mother's address to Valero. However, Valero himself was killed in an abrupt, almost anticlimactic moment shortly thereafter. The grim determination of the dwindling group of survivors solidified into a fatalistic bond, and, still, the losses weighed heavily upon them. This grief tightened the coil of rage within Audie Murphy. The final, brutal straw came during the landing at Yellow Beach in mid-August. The pre-invasion bombardment by battleships offered the men little comfort. The old, cold fear gripped them as they approached the shore. The illusion of an orderly advance was instantly shattered by the discovery of extensive minefields. Soldiers moved, gingerly, as if walking on eggs, across the ground. The inevitable explosions introduced the medics to horrific scenes of injury. It was here, in the chaos of the beachhead, that Brandon fell. Brandon was the quiet, stoic man from Kentucky. He was killed while trying to help Murphy. The sudden, arbitrary death of this steadfast comrade triggered a profound emotional breakdown in Murphy. Brandon had faced the devil at Salerno and kept his head at Anzio. Murphy's grief and rage boiled over, transforming him into a demon. He seized a machine gun and systematically engaged the enemy. His desperate pleas for his pinned-down comrades echoed in the chaos. He unleashed a surge of violent, uncontrollable action. This marked a complete loss of his emotional control. The campaign ground north through the territory. The true test of endurance arrived with the Battle of the Colmar Pocket. It was the most brutal phase yet encountered. The battle was characterized by freezing weather and the constant, demoralizing knowledge that infantry attacks had to continue. They had to proceed regardless of cost, simply to prevent German redeployments elsewhere. The initial attacks were launched without adequate armor support. They faltered immediately against accurate German fire. The soldiers were reduced to cringing in the snow like miserable, frightened and frozen rats. Their teeth chattered and their faces turned blue. Their feet were numb in the slush and ice. The battlefield became a grim, frozen landscape. It was littered with dead men and abandoned equipment. This devastation fueled bitter curses and talk of suicide missions among the remaining men. The lack of Allied armor was a dire disadvantage. It was especially problematic against the German heavy tanks. These tanks proved devastatingly effective against the exposed infantry. During one particularly devastating mortar barrage, the unit found itself pinned down and bleeding out. The sliver of hope arrived, with 3 tanks. Their presence, however, was fleeting and short-lived. One tank commander was crippled and watched his vehicle burn. He made a heroic, yet ultimately futile sacrifice. As the tank emitted black smoke and the stench of burning flesh, the commander acted. Despite his wounds, he deliberately positioned the burning husk to shield wounded men. His sacrifice was a desperate act of individual resilience. It underscored the brutal necessity of holding the line at all costs. The relentless advance continued, demanding individual acts of brutal efficiency. The tide of war eventually found its mark on Murphy. The strategic loss of armor support exposed the infantry to devastating losses. This loss occurred due to the critical collapse of a bridge during an advance. Murphy, despite his growing experience and effectiveness in combat, was not immune to the arbitrary violence of the front. During a skirmish after dusk in the Vosges, he suffered a severe hip wound. The searing pain felt like a white-hot brand on his body. Barker, who had accompanied him earlier on a sniper hunt, helped the wounded Murphy off the field. This severe injury marked a physical and emotional breaking point. It led directly to his evacuation and the end of his direct combat role. He was reduced to a number. His body was broken and his spirit was exhausted, but he had survived the fighting. In the hospital, he had a humorous and poignant reunion with Kerrigan. Kerrigan had lost half a hand but was still playing cards. This was a grim testament to the enduring bonds forged in the crucible of combat. Murphy's war in the field was finally over. Yet the long, arduous battle for his inner peace had just begun. The breakthrough of the Siegfried Line was a strategic victory long sought by Allied command. It did not bring with it a wave of triumphant relief to the soldiers. They had bought each mile with blood and sacrifice. The final stages of the war had witnessed the ultimate psychological breaking point for many veterans. This cemented a profound, weary cynicism among them. Comrades like Anders had returned to the line after being wounded. He finally cracked under the relentless artillery fire. His nerves were jumping around like frogs until he was mercifully sent to the rear. Rusty, another soldier, succumbed to a severe psychological breakdown. His desperate desire to avoid combat manifested in repeated, muttered phrases like "save your Brett." The relentless grind had reduced them to their primal fear. This demonstrated that the psychological cost was often more final than a bullet. The war had stripped away the facade of the hardened killer. It revealed men capable of immense empathy. Yet they were burdened by an overwhelming, lingering trauma. The news of VE Day, when it finally arrived, was met with a profound apathy. It was a weary indifference that defied the external celebrations. Audie Murphy found himself at a temporary staging area in the Mediterranean. The air there was thick with the scent of pine and salt. It was a world utterly divorced from the stench of mud and burning flesh. He woke that morning to the sound of an orchestra playing in the distance. Bells were ringing. And there was the general gaiety of a world suddenly released from the stranglehold of conflict. Yet this external peace clashed violently with his internal world. He felt an intense, irrational irritation. He felt a deep-seated resistance to the joy that seemed so facile and unearned. The casual exchanges of soldiers around him felt alien. They talked of finding beds and companionship. They observed that, "This burg's loaded with soldiers." One added, "If you want a dame, you'll have to hustle." These exchanges highlighted his profound disconnect from civilian life. In a quiet moment of visceral reflection, he picked up his service pistol. The mechanism was butter smooth. The cold blue steel possessed a lethal beauty. For months, this tool of death had been his most reliable companion. It had been more faithful than most friends. This was a grim reflection of how the necessity of violence had distorted his worldview. Contemplating the pistol triggered an involuntary, rapid-fire internal flashback. It was a horror film run backwards of the carnage that had branded him. The images were fragmented and devastating to his mind. He saw a tank in the snow, its metal still warm. It was surrounded by the smouldering remains of men. He recalled the sight and stench of burning flesh. He saw the ghosts of his fallen comrades. He saw Novak, the fiercely loyal Pole, rotting in a grave on Anzio. He saw Horseface, the teller of tall tales, reduced to a casualty of random shrapnel. He saw Antonio, the thirsty Italian-American, trying to stand on the stumps of his legs as a machine gun ripped his body apart. He saw Brandon, the quiet Kentuckian, dead beneath a cork tree. He recalled Elleridge, the former schoolteacher, his feet severely injured. Elleridge had vowed never to enter a classroom again. His future aspirations were scorched clean by the war's fire. These memories were interspersed with the haunting image of a charred hulk of something that once was green. This was a powerful metaphor for the destruction of innocence and life itself. The memory montage confirmed a terrifying truth. The war had left him branded and stripped of decency. It necessitated a conscious, agonizing effort to reclaim his humanity. Despite the cynicism formed by years of killing, A core belief persisted. He knew that dead men do not look noble, yet his enduring faith in camaraderie and patriotic duty remained. The psychological toll of the war was immense. The internal battle for peace demanded the same courage he had shown on the front lines. The narrative of his life could not end there. It could not be defined solely by trauma. In a solemn, quiet moment, Audie Murphy made a powerful vow that committed himself to actively measure up to the demands of life. He committed himself to seeking love and finding faith. He resolved to learn the simple, profound ability to work in peace. This signified the arduous individual commitment required to overcome his psychological scars. It began the long process of rebuilding his inner world. The external fighting was finally over. The war to reclaim his soul, however, had just begun. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.